everybody was excited about when they would finally get married. That was the question for 43 years. On the red carpet, reporters asked. Talk show hosts held it up with a knowing grin. Fans disagreed about it in the comments. The tabloids ran the same headlines every year, just like the seasons do every year. Are they going to do it or not? It was like not having a ring was a problem that needed to be fixed. It was like what Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell had made together was lost in some way. The tougher question wasn't asked by anyone. What if they knew something we didn't? Because this is what the cameras didn't fully catch. And 43 years of proof makes it impossible to ignore. These two people saw their marriage destroy almost everything they loved before they got married. Slowly at first, then all of a sudden, as damage often does, they watched it. They had to deal with those endings, with the lawyers, the silences, and the kids who were caught in the middle. And they made a choice that no one, not even Hollywood, was ready to follow through with. They chose not to do the experiment again. Instead, they built something else. Not a give and take or a weaker version of commitment. Something calmer, stronger, and by all the standards that matter. Something that has survived the marriages of almost every couple who tease them for not having one. In a clear way that can only come from having lived through the other option, Goldie Hawn has said it. Marriage isn't necessary for a relationship to last. It's about getting along and talking to each other. What Kurt Russell said was as simple and direct as a person who only means what they say. We got along and agreed. Have fun until you don't. 43 years have passed. 43. There was no contract, ceremony, or official vow that was said in front of witnesses. Still, a family with 4 kids who grew up in one house. Decades of private loyalty in one of the most publicly damaging places on earth. And her own daughter, Kate Hudson, talks about their love in the kind of detail that only someone who has seen something in person can understand. Kurt loves my mom so much. I see him. He really loves her a lot. So, before this story goes on, think about the real question. What is the secret in this case? Who thought it was so bad? Before Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell made their choice together. You need to know why they made it. You have to think about the wreckage that each of them brought to the 1983 movie set on their own, in silence, and with the weariness of people who have already learned how expensive it is to get something this important wrong. Goldie Hawn was one of the most famous women in the world when she got to the set of Swing Shift. With an Oscar and a string of hits, she became the kind of star that movie studios planned their event around. A laugh that had become a part of culture in some way. The picture looked bright from the outside. It had been anything but from the inside. In 1969, she got married to dancer and director Gus Trionis. They split up 7 years later. The specifics were mostly kept secret because she wanted to, but the outcome was the same as it always is. A life split up and a name change again. The slow, boring work of putting together again a self that a marriage had broken up in parts. She had just turned 31 and was beginning anew. The musician Bill Hudson then showed up. The couple had 2 children together, Oliver and Kate. The relationship ended in 1982 with a kind of breakup that doesn't stay between the 2 people involved. When parents fail, the effects on children are felt in ways that don't show up for years. Goldie knew this. It happened right in front of her eyes in her own home, on the faces of the people she loved the most. When she walked onto the set of Swing Shift, she had been through 2 marriages, 2 divorces, and the clarity that comes after being hurt deeply for a long time. She wasn't angry. That was never how she was. But she was honest with herself in a way that doesn't happen very often in fame, but always does in real life. In the end, she turned it into a question. A number of questions were asked not as rhetoric, but as the conclusions of someone who had done the math and found that the numbers did not add up. How many split-ups are fun? What number of divorces don't cost money? How many splits make you hate the other person even more than before? How many splits have been bad for kids? There was already an answer to every question. She knew it already. Kurt Russell showed up with his own answer to the same set. He began his journey into acting before most people did. He worked on Disney sets as a child before he was old enough to fully understand what a job was. The son of actor Bing Russell, he grew up in a business like many other kids do whose parents run a business. He learned the rhythms and costs of it before he could name them. He was no longer a child actor going through adolescence on screen. When he was in his 20s, he was a leading man working on something important, and he knew that the life he had chosen made normal daily life really hard. From 1979 to 1983, he was married to actress Susan Hubley for years and one son named Boston Russell. Then the same ending we all know: the papers were filed, the family split up, the child went on to live two different lives that used to be one. He got a swing shift. Then, as a man who had also done the math and reached a point where experience had replaced theory, he knew what marriage could cost, not in a general way, but in terms of certain and unchangeable currency of family. They didn't think about what would happen when they were in the same room together. They met for the first time much earlier, in 1966, on the set of the one and only real original Family Band. Kurt was 16 and Goldie was 21. There was such a big time gap between them that the meeting didn't even register as an introduction. Two people in very different parts of their lives who briefly share the same set before going their separate ways. There was no story there. Not yet. It's been 17 years. Then there was a swing shift and something neither of them had been looking for. This is usually how the most durable things start. There was neither a search nor a plan. Just two people in a room who knew what they didn't want and had learned the hard way what they didn't want. They saw something in each other that was different from everything else that had happened. Later, Kurt would talk about it in his usual straightforward way. We had both been divorced by that time. We got along and agreed. Have fun until you don't. That's what was agreed upon. It was mild in language, but very strong in what it meant. There was no promise of permanence, and no contract signed before the evidence came in. There was only honesty, the kind that requires two people that have been hurt enough to stop lying and brave enough to start anyway. In 1983, they didn't know how long the fun would last. They couldn't have known that we wouldn't get there until it was too late. They had no idea that the deal they made without a ring, a ceremony, or even official witness would last longer than almost every marriage in their business and become one of the most famous love stories in Hollywood history, all while hiding in plain sight under a question that no one was asking the right way. But the building came before the endurance. And before the building started, the question that any two people in their situation would have had to honestly answer in private, away from the cameras, the news, and the expectation of a world that thought it already knew how this kind of story should end. The question wasn't if they'll get married. What are they really building was the question. During the building of any long-term relationship, there comes a time when the architecture can be seen. Not the public version, with the red carpets, coordinated looks, and photos that magazines caption with phrases like, "still going strong." But the structure that's really there, the choices that were made repeatedly and quietly, without anyone watching, the way two people deal with the daily stress of living together when the newness has worn off, and all that's left is the truth about who they are to each other. For Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell, that architecture had a clear and planned form. Even though they lived together, they kept their own spaces, a choice that made outsiders confused and kept them going the whole time. Not separate homes because of cold or distance, but separate rooms in the same house, separate closets and separate retreats. This is the kind of physical independence that keeps two people separate while they're together, rather than slowly merging into a single identity that neither of them owns. Goldie talked about it in his usual direct way. "I don't feel trapped." Just 3 words. A whole philosophy of love, squished into a single breath. That's not what she meant by detachment. It wasn't like that, since she had lived in the other option. The structure was made to protect the attachment. She knew what it's like to feel suffocated when a relationship stops being a choice and turns into an obligation, when someone assumes your presence instead of offering it, when two people can't see each other clearly because they are too close to each other to pay attention. She had seen how that dynamic destroyed the things she held most dear, and she was determined to never let it happen again. Kurt understood this in the same way, not as a theory, not as an idea taken from self-help or therapy, but as a man who had been in a marriage that ended and come to his own conclusions about what keeps people going and what makes them weaker over time. They didn't show indifference by letting each other be free. It was the base of everything else. They used that base to build a family. By 1986, 3 years into a relationship that hadn't been officially declared permanent, Goldie gave birth to their son Wyatt Russell. It was not in the context of a marriage, but in something they had decided was more reliable than a marriage. A promise made every day rather than because the law says you have to. A presence that had to be earned over time because it wasn't required by contract. Around Wyatt grew a family that didn't fit into the neat boxes that divorce culture tend to make. Oliver Hudson, Kate Hudson, and Boston Russell are 4 kids from 3 different relationships who moved in together and were raised together with the kind of intentionality that blended families need when they're working and don't need when they're not. It worked, according to the children who went through it, and are now adults with their own kids. Kate Hudson has talked about her family in a way that shows how she grew up in a home where honesty was taught rather than expected. She has given the best picture of what that life was really like from the inside, not the version that was put together for interviews or profiles. The version that only someone who watched it over many years and in everyday situations that no camera caught can see. She has said, "Kurt just adores my mom. And I see him. He just loves her so much." That statement wasn't made with the excitement of celebrity endorsing something, but with the quiet confidence of a daughter talking about something she has seen many times. For all of her life has more weight than any official statement they could have made. That's the proof. That's the record. Even so, the house where all of this happened, the real house, will become the setting for the story's darkest chapter. In 2020, Goldie and Kurt's home in Pacific Palisades was broken into while the world was still in the middle of a pandemic that made everyday life feel rough and strange. As is often the case with planned violations, the timing was spot on, almost 3 hours. That was the time when the couple wasn't there. It's long enough to be deliberate, but short enough to make you think of surveillance. Someone who had been keeping an eye on things, knew how the family worked, and waited